Stop, Mara, thank you. Nobody for the next stop. I want to take you back to 1127. 1127. Where we are now would have been a massive forest. None of these buildings would have existed, needless to say, including the palace and the abbey. This is where the King of Scotland hunted. It's 1127 and King David I is on the throne of Scotland. He's hunting in these grounds. He's separated from his courtiers. He falls off his horse and he's attacked by a massive white hart. H-A-R-T, a stag. And according to King David I, he prayed to God for forgiveness. Please forgive me for hunting on the Sabbath. And again, according to King David I, he had a religious vision, and a cross came between him and the stag to save him. And that's where we get the name Holy Rood from, Holy Cross, from the days of King David I. He became Scotland's holy king. He had many religious buildings built, not least the abbey, the ruined abbey at the side of the palace, a year later, 1128. And I'm going to point out the ruined abbey to you if you've not seen it already. I'm afraid there's scaffolding around it for a few weeks or so you can't see it. It's a ruined abbey, like I say, but if you go to the palace you can go and see it. Badly damaged during the Reformation, and also by Oliver Cromwell and his troops. Cromwell's troops actually were in this park. The army, Cromwell's army was in this park. So we're back in the park. Very popular place today for cycle racing, marathons and so on. We believe one of these stages of the Tour de France is going to be staged here in a few years' time. There's a wee boy from Devon on my bus a few months ago, and he said, how are the cyclists going to get from France? And I said, well, they're going to come up through England into Scotland. And he said they're going to have to go over the English Channel then, aren't they? And I said, yes, that's right. This wee boy was 7 years old. And he said, how are they going to ride the cycles across the English Channel? I said, I think they'll put the cycles on the ferry, and the ferry will go across and then they get back on. And I just thought it was an amazing question from a 7-year-old boy. It was a logical question, of course, you know. Might seem a funny question to us, but it was a logical question. Coming up on your right-hand side, where the white lorry is, it's reversing. I want you to look down there, and when you look down there, when we get there, because we're going to the left, I want you to look at the palace, and to the left of the palace, where the scaffolding is, looking down, is the ruined abbey. So just here where I'm pointing, look to the left of the palace, see where the scaffolding is, that's the ruined abbey. They're just doing a few repairs. The scaffolding is not usually there, of course. We're on the Royal Mile, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Royal Mile, which goes from the palace behind you to the castle behind me. This is a Scottish mile. That's not a joke. A Scottish mile was traditionally longer than an English mile. Weights and measures in Scotland were different from England, the same today. This is Queensberry House on your left-hand side. You might have heard of the Marquis of Queensberry, who introduced the rules for boxing. Does anybody want the next stop for the Canongate Kirk, coming up on your right? Canongate Kirk or church is where the Queen worships when she comes to Edinburgh. It's where Adam Smith is buried, the great Scottish economist. He wrote The Wealth of Nations. Look at the top of the church. Can you see the golden antlers and the cross from the story I've just told you about King David I? The antlers and the cross. Robert Ferguson is also buried there. Robert Ferguson was a great Scottish poet. He wrote in Scots and in English, and he was a great influence on Robert Burns. When Burns first came to the city, He was devastated because there was no headstone for his great hero. Ferguson died at 24, so he paid for a headstone for Ferguson. So this is the Cannon Gate. Used to be spelled G-A-I-T. So Canon was ecclesiastical, gate G-A-I-T, meaning walk, the monk's walk. Look at the two spellings. Look at the modern day spelling on your right, the Cannon Gate, the Royal Mile. Look at the old spelling on your left where the pub is, the Canon's Gate, the monk's walk. So why did they change G-A-I-T to G-A-T-E? The Reformation, of course. Anything with Catholic connotations was changed, and the monk's walk was not acceptable to a lot of people after the Reformation. Which is a bit confusing because people come to Edinburgh and look at the Cannon Gate and they expect military cannons, a gate with military cannons. It's nothing to do with the military, it was ecclesiastical. It was the monk's walk. And this was the borough of Canon's Gate. This was the borough of the monk's walk. This was outside the city. In front of us would have been the main gateway into Old Edinburgh. It would have been the Netherbow Gate. Because this is where the... Look on your left-hand side, down St Mary's Street, right at the bottom on the right. Can you see the remains of the Flodden Wall? Right at the bottom. And that wall would have gone right around the city for hundreds of years. Anybody want the next stop? Stop number 6. Stop number 6 for John Knox's house. Right-hand side, 15th century. Mowbray House, 15th century. Nobody upstairs, thank you. Now, John Knox was the main preacher during the Reformation. But if you just look at the back of the bush, you'll see Mowbray House, which is also 15th century. Mowbray House is really interesting because Mowbray House was the home of Daniel Defoe for about 14 months. Now, you'll all know Daniel Defoe from Robinson Crusoe. Robinson Crusoe was, in fact, the first book I ever read as a wee boy. But I only found out 15 years ago that Daniel Defoe in 1707 was an English government spy. And he was planted in the city by the English to make sure that the union between England and Scotland went through smoothly. This was the first case in the world of fake news. You've all heard of fake news, haven't you? This was the first case. I'm making this up. I'm embellishing this, right? But he was planted in the city. His cover, quite simply, as a great English novelist, was he was going to start a new literary magazine in Edinburgh. But in actual fact, he was a James Bond type figure. And he lived there for 14 months. Didn't have much to do because the union went through very smoothly, but just in case it didn't go through, he was plotting away and spying on people who were maybe against the union or whatever. And I think there's a great film to be made there. Daniel Defoe in Edinburgh in 1707. He loved Scotland. He travelled quite extensively in Scotland. But he only stayed here in Edinburgh about 14 months. So this is the Royal Mile. The Royal Mile has 5 sections. Abbey Strand, which is self-explanatory, where I've just showed you where the Abbey is. Cannon Gate, where we've just been. The High Street, the Lawn Market, and Castle Hill. So it's got 5 sections to it. And remember, this is the lava that flowed down 340 million years ago from the Castle Rock, which is a volcano. So this is Mother Nature underneath us forming the very first thoroughfare in what would eventually become Edinburgh, all those hundreds of millions of years ago. So it's quite amazing. I want to talk about recent times, however, not too recent. I want to talk maybe 400 years ago. Buildings on each side of us 400 years ago, not these buildings, would have been an incredible 12 to 14 stories high. Quite possibly the very first skyscrapers anywhere in the world. I'm going to say that again because it's so unbelievable you probably think I've got it wrong. These buildings would have been 12 to 14 stories high. The bottom would have been sandstone, but most of the rest of these buildings would have been wooden, of course. Dangerous, undoubtedly. A fire hazard, definitely. Many fires in Edinburgh, and as soon as they could lower the heights of the buildings or start using more sandstone, they did, of course. One of the consequences of this, though, and something we're very proud of in Edinburgh, because of so many fires, we had the very first municipal fire brigade anywhere in the world. The first publicly funded professional fire brigade was in Edinburgh. The church that you see in front of the bus on the left-hand side with the clock is the Tron Kirk, or church, if you want to call it a church. It's not been a church for a long time, 17th century. But the Tron is also famous for it. Well, first of all, it gets its name from the Tron was a weighing machine, and there was a weighing machine on the other side of the church that used to weigh butter and cheese. But the Tron is very famous in Scottish ballads, in other words songs, Scottish folk songs, for being the place where the punishments used to take place.